And without further ado, please help me to welcome our very own Khalil Shariff.
Thanks, Uju. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's a great delight to welcome you all to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate for today's session. We are gathered, as I think you all know, on the traditional lands of the Algonquin people, who for centuries welcomed people from all parts of this very, very large area here at the point where the three rivers meet in a spirit of hospitality and of exchange of goods and services for sure, but also of relationships and of ideas. And we start this morning, in a sense, trying to sustain and be inspired by that tradition as we gather here together to talk and to relate to each other about one of the great challenges of our time, which is climate change. We are hosting a session today that is part of a broader series on climate action. Climate action is the existential question of our time, but it is not the only one. We still have the vast majority of humanity who can't look to the future with a sense of confidence because the basic human capital investments and the economic opportunities and even cultural vitality are questions. And so our series here is focused on the nexus of our climate action responsibilities and our global development responsibilities. How do we join these? How can this become a joint agenda so that there's not tension, but magic in how these two things come together? Last month, we had an extraordinary session with James Mwangi, who is the executive director of Dalberg globally, who had come here from Kenya to talk a bit about the jobs crisis in Africa over the next 2 decades, given the demographic bulge of young people on the continent, and how climate action might be the single biggest opportunity for economic advance for the continent. But that wouldn't necessarily be the default. It had to be designed deliberately in that way. And so we were treated to, I think, a very important agenda. Today, we are talking about one of the most important technologies available to us. In fact, it's a technology that's been available to humanity since time immemorial, which is to say nature itself. And we're delighted to be able to host a conversation among leading experts in the practical application of nature-based solutions to our climate challenges, with a particular focus on how do we use the knowledge, indigenous knowledge and local knowledge available in all the communities around the world where climate is becoming such an important factor in their life and livelihoods, and to use those as part of the arsenal of assets to address the climate crisis. The Aga Khan Development Network globally has made climate a central priority and is committed to joining it to our long-standing development goals to make sure that we are bringing these agendas together. We have an extraordinary treat today because we have with us, who has agreed to moderate, Patricia Fuller, who is really one of the outstanding Canadian diplomats of her time. She has served in a number of capacities over the years, including as our ambassador to a number of countries in South America. But most recently, just before she retired, she was Canada's ambassador for climate change. She's now a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa, lending her time and talent and wisdom to activities like this one. And so we're really very, very grateful, Patricia, that you've taken the time to join us. And with that, I will hand it over to Patricia to take us through the program. Patricia.
Pleasure to be here with you. Great pleasure to know that the Aga Khan Foundation is focusing one of these sessions on the important topic of nature-based solutions. And as Khalil has alluded to, nature can indeed be our biggest ally in addressing the climate crisis, whether it's through absorbing carbon or through increasing our resilience to the impact of climate change. But the reality is that we're working more against nature than with it at the current time, as the numbers on nature conservation and biodiversity are going in the wrong direction. So we're facing a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. And what I've seen in the international discussions is that there is, I would say just in the last 3 years in particular, a real recognition that we need to address these crises together in a holistic way. I think I really saw that recognition come to the fore in the COP, which took place in Madrid. You can remember that far back, pre-pandemic. But there, nature-based solutions began to be a term that was discussed widely. Of course, it's long been recognized that carbon sequestration is an important aspect of addressing climate change, but there's also a much stronger recognition around the important role it can play in increasing resilience, whether it's the cooling effect of trees in these urban areas or the effect of mangroves in protecting coastlines. So it was the recognition of the adaptation value that led the Global Commission on Adaptation to place a particular focus on nature-based solutions. Canada was part of that Global Commission, and we led the action track together with Mexico, which looked at leading examples around the world. And we found those in diverse places, including, for example, in Peru, where indigenous knowledge around water storage in the Andes was used to combat water scarcity, or the tree planting initiatives at scale in Ethiopia, or the Room for the River initiative in the Netherlands. So today, I'm looking forward to this discussion with some great experts, and I'm going to start by asking Jimena to please come and join me on the stage. So Jimena Izaguirre is a senior climate adaptation specialist at ESSA Technologies, which is headquartered in Vancouver. And she has 18 years of experience in research and analysis and a breadth of Canadian and international experience in adaptation and climate resilience, including program design, policy analysis, vulnerability assessment, and monitoring and evaluation. She is also vice president of the Canada Matare, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Education Trust, which is a Canadian charitable organization dedicated to advancing education in Kenya. So welcome, Jimena. Thanks for being here. And now I will introduce our two online panelists, who I'm hoping will pop up on the screen over here for us to see. So I'm going to start with Didier van Bignoot, who is the Global Advisor for Agriculture, Food Security, and Climate Resilience at the AKFC Foundation. And there he is. Hello, Didier. Didier is an agronomist and a professional trainer of trainers in regenerative agriculture with more than 22 years of experience working in integrated rural development, farm system management, and climate resilience in Africa, the Indian Ocean, Asia, and the Middle East. And he joined the AKFC Foundation in 2014 and is currently based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Thank you for joining us, Didier.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then last but not least, we have Benjamin Simons, who is Director of Sustainable Infrastructure and the first director of the Nature-Based Infrastructure Global Resource Center. I'm pleased to say I was part of the launch of that at COP26 at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Ben has over 20 years of experience establishing leading global environmental partnerships and initiatives. And most recently, before going to IISD, he was at UNEP, where he held a number of senior positions. And he is based in Washington, DC. So with no further ado, we will start our discussion. And I'm going to start with Benjamin. So Ben, as the director of this new center at the Global Resource Center that you're leading to help people better understand nature-based solutions and particularly the opportunities for advancing nature-based infrastructure in the place of conventional projects, I'd like to ask, how do you define and think about nature-based solutions? And can you speak to the urgency to employ them and scale up these types of solutions to climate change? Ben, please.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Patricia. And I'd also like to thank the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada for inviting me to join this important event today. To address the first part of your question, I think the best way to think about nature-based solutions and the way that we think about it in the ISD Sustainable Infrastructure team is largely based on how it has been defined and applied by governments. The two definitions that are most often used is the one from IUCN that was defined a few years ago, and then actually more recently, there was a definition agreed to by the world's environment ministers in March this year at the United Nations Environment Assembly. And if you look at these two definitions, and although I think they're phrased slightly differently, they're really largely aligned and have three basic parts. The first is that nature-based solutions are defined as having an action in nature. And this can be things such as protecting, conserving, restoring, or sustainably using biodiversity and ecosystems. The second part of the definition is that the action has to address a much broader societal or sustainability challenge. And we've already spoken this morning, Patricia, you mentioned, the opening address as well mentioned the importance of addressing climate change. And climate change is one of those major societal challenges that nature-based solutions have the opportunity to address. And the third part of the definition is that in addressing this challenge, the nature-based solution needs to provide benefits, both for human well-being and biodiversity or ecosystems. So really, it's those three key parts that help define nature-based solutions: an action based in nature, addressing a sustainability or societal challenge, and providing a benefit to human well-being and ecosystems. And in this sense, nature-based solutions is really an umbrella concept that reflects a culmination of a trend that we've seen over the last several decades, in which people are now working to proactively protect, manage, and restore ecosystems to address societal challenges, rather than simply being passive beneficiaries of nature. I think the second part of your question was really, what is driving so much interest in nature-based solutions right now, and why is it urgent to scale up these solutions? I think in a nutshell, the increasing interest in NBS reflects the increase in societal challenges we are facing, and nature-based solutions, as we have already indicated, can provide multiple benefits and tend to be a very cost-effective solution. In terms of societal challenges, these will not be new to any of us, and you've mentioned a few of those, including the climate change crisis we're currently facing. I think it was a bit disheartening when the WMO announced last month that we now have a 50% chance of exceeding 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years, and we anticipate that the long-term average where we'll be exceeding 1.5 degrees will start around just over a decade. Obviously, ecosystem degradation, loss of nature, is another major societal challenge, but we also have water security, food security, human health, and economic and social development, including addressing the infrastructure gap. And that's something obviously we focus a lot on at ISD with the Sustainable Infrastructure team. And what's interesting is that these challenges and crises have triggered a whole slew of commitments by governments, both national and local, and other actors, including the private sector. And most of these are well known, but of course the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, net zero commitments, and more recently, nature positive commitments. And of course, all of these actors taking on these commitments are looking for cost-effective solutions. And as a result, the interest in nature-based solutions is dramatically increasing. Just as an example of the potential impact from nature-based solutions on climate mitigation, nature-based solutions have been seen to potentially supply up to 37% of our climate change mitigation needs. So there's incredible opportunity there. However, despite the growing interest in nature-based solutions, it still receives relatively little actual financing as compared to other solutions to these issues. found in 2017, 2018, only around 8% of public funding for climate action supported nature-based climate solutions, and less than 3.5% of public funding supported nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. So what does all this mean? First, we do have this urgency to employ nature-based solutions to address sustainability challenges. Second, given the commitments by governments and others, we are very likely to see growing interest in nature-based solutions. Third, given the relatively limited investment in nature-based solutions today, we will likely see an increasing flow of capital into this space in the coming years. But finally, this increasing interest and investment will create clearly some important opportunities and benefits for nature and human well-being, but also, and this is important, significant risks that need to be addressed. And I hope we'll have a chance to discuss some of these risks a bit further into the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, Ben, so you've given us a comprehensive picture of the expected benefits of nature-based solutions, and certainly the benefits for biodiversity and climate change, I think, are what is driving the great interest in these solutions. But as you alluded to, there's also economic and social benefits, and in many contexts, I think that can facilitate the implementation of these solutions. Those benefits for social goals. So Didier, I'd like to ask you to expand on those around the benefits of nature-based solutions for addressing social inequities and for supporting sustainable livelihoods.
Thank you so much. Well, two main inequalities and unfairness of our time are gender inequalities and also just simply poverty. It is more expensive to be poor than to be rich, and it's always more difficult to be dealing with livelihood as a woman and man, of course. This is why it is essential to bring forward the gender dimension in climate change, because women are precisely the main group that are suffering most from the impact of climate change. And the reasons are quite simple. First of all, they're more likely than men to live in poverty. They have less access to basic services and rights. They face systematic violence in times of crisis. And they're, of course, also more proportionally dependent on threatened natural resources. Therefore, it is absolutely essential to design nature-based solutions taking into account women and poverty in general. So how do we do this, and how is it possible to address them? There are really two main approaches. One is a systemic approach through integrated farming systems, for example. We can give the example of what we're doing through regenerative agriculture. We have a very good example in Madagascar, where we've developed a rice cultivation system, a direct seeded system that reduces by more than 50% women labor, particularly with the nursery stage and the transplanting. But it can also be done through key practices that are quite simple, affordable, and very impactful. I'll give the example of water and rainwater harvesting. India is a leading country with AKFC in this area, but really, you know, if you're harvesting the water that falls on the roof of your house or hut, and you do it systematically using very simple equipment, even in areas where you only have 200 millimeters of rain per year, if you have a roof that is 5 meters by 10 meters, you're going to be able to harvest about 10 metric tons of water, which is about 10,000 liters, which represents about a little bit less than 30 liters per day, which is enough. Would it be just to provide drinking water if it's well treated for a family? And 200 millimeters is really the areas where we have the lowest rainfall in our areas of interventions, such as Syria. I think another very significant key practice and nature-based solution that we bring forward is a microforest. It's often connected to a kitchen garden with a very high level of biodiversity. With the microforest, we're speaking about very small forests, about 100 square meters, but at least 25 to 50 species that grow together. And this is really a translation of the Miyawaki forest that was designed by a Japanese expert. But with our translation and through AKF, what we're doing is we're promoting microforests that are edible, that are producing a large quantity of fruits and foods, but also feed, dye, medicine, and so on. So very useful ones, and they're always we're always trying to connect them with kitchen gardens that will provide also a large diversity of foods. In the case of mountain areas like in Kyrgyzstan or in Tajikistan and Pakistan as well, we are also promoting greenhouses with that are very, very simple, low cost, and yet extremely efficient in expanding the duration of the cropping season. And in coastal areas of Africa, for example, we're promoting, of course, in the intertidal zone, the protection of mangroves, but we do it in a way that provides income and provides and supports livelihoods. For example, like in Mozambique with the Meldomar project through beekeeping. And then you have other practices such as rooftop gardens in Egypt, Aswan, that have been very successful, particularly, of course, among women. But another one that I believe also is really taking off in our geographies, and particularly in South Asia and Africa, is a local production of natural inputs. When you allow communities to produce locally their own natural pesticides, their organic fertilizers, and their quality seeds, you definitely allow women particularly to take a better control on their farming activities and on the health and nutrition of the household, despite the situation of climate change. Actually, you know, setting up seed banks that are revolving, that are promoting local varieties, that are known for being you know, very hardy and drought tolerant and pest resistant, you are able to really act very strongly towards this. And then all these approaches around farming systems and key practices can only be reinforced by women economic empowerment. And then in turn, that women economic empowerment reinforces those practices and this integrated approach to farming. And to do so, we promote community-based saving groups that are well known for having always a majority of women, cooperatives that are involved in value addition or production, or also management of natural resources such as water for irrigation, for example. And then, of course, there's this whole dimension around micro-entrepreneurship, where we're very much involved in women economic empowerment. So it's a whole ecosystem. It is complex, but really fascinating. And we are currently developing extremely interesting solutions and projects that really make us enjoy the work we're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So you've given a real range of examples of projects that are nature positive, climate positive, but also hugely productive in terms of development benefits and social benefits. So I think that's really the sweet spot, and great to have those concrete examples from around the world. And I want to just stay with the aspect of social benefits, but ask you, Jimena, to kind of drill into a little bit the benefits in particular for marginalized and diverse communities, because I think your extensive experience in this space could give us some insight into how can nature-based solutions address the needs of at-risk populations.
Thanks, Patricia. And thanks for those great examples of on-the-ground action with those different approaches. Just to step back, I'm coming to this conversation as the business area lead for climate change adaptation at my firm, ESSA, which has the mission of sustaining healthy ecosystems and human communities. This organization has been around for over 40 years, and we've done a lot of nature-based solutions adjacent work, I would say, focused on ecosystem restoration, but mostly for the benefit of critters. So on the nature side, a lot of ecosystem restoration projects, river basin restoration, ecological flow modeling, all of that technical work to inform protection of species at risk, to inform decisions around dam releases, that kind of thing, but mostly for the benefit of nature. So that's one hat. The other hat is, as Patricia mentioned, is that I am part of this Canada Mathari Education Trust, and we work alongside youth to increase education opportunities for high achieving low income youth in the second largest slum of Kenya. And from that part of the work that I do, combining with ESSA, I see a lot of opportunities to combine the nature focused work that we do kind of on the technical side, more so here in Canada. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, I think, with some of the needs that are around the world, around all these other sustainable development goals, more on the people side. So combining nature and people-centered solutions together. And in terms of ensuring or finding ways to, for these nature-based solutions to address the needs of marginalized and diverse communities, from where I'm sitting, and as a professional consultant, I think about 3 scales, one at the project scale, at the community scale, and then at the larger bioregional or systems scale. And I'm going to primarily refer to the first 2 scales, as the other one has already been touched on a bit, and I think we'll probably go there a little bit later in this conversation. But at the project scale, I see lots of opportunities to drive equitable outcomes through the processes or the techniques that we use, that we bring to the work that we do for the commission work that we're engaged in. So for example, we, through ESSA, within the life cycle of nature-based solutions, we mainly work on the planning side. So at the upfront, all the assessment work, modeling work, and scoping, engagement, that kind of thing. And then on the monitoring side, so once the implementation has been of this nature-based solution or intervention has been done, and people want to understand what the actual effect of that intervention has been. And on the planning side, we use and have used approaches such as conceptual models, which are very stripped down, basically box and narrow diagrams that link understanding of different stressors and pressures on natural assets and ecological flows or ecosystem services flowing from those natural assets, and connecting those to outcomes that people care about, such as food security or water security, health, education, livelihoods, etc. So these are conceptual, we call them models because they can be very sophisticated simulation models, but they can actually be just box and arrow diagrams that are drawn on paper. And those can be done, with a range of participants and at a range of scales. So that's one technique that we use primarily to scope the focal ecosystem services that are of interest to the clients we work with and their stakeholders. So we can relate those focal ecosystem services to outcomes that people care about. So that's one. The second one is participatory mapping. So we need to understand, when we go into a project and understand the potential for nature-based solutions, we need to understand what are those natural assets on the ground, like where do they occur? What are their characteristics? And so there's a number of tools from low tech to high tech that can be used for participatory mapping. And then then the other tool or technique is around condition and risk assessment of these natural assets. So once you know what are the assets on the ground, an aquifer, a mangrove, et cetera, you need to also understand what the quality of those assets are and what are the risks that they're facing. And so there are a number of techniques, again, both low and high tech, that can be applied to make these determinations. And local knowledge is extremely valuable for understanding these conditions on the ground, especially in data limited conditions. Like there's an incredible development in global data sets that can be harnessed, but at the local level, their accuracy is not great. So bringing in that local knowledge to not only understand where the assets are, but what their condition is and what the risk they're facing is incredibly important, and harnessing that local knowledge, including experience, knowledge, views from diverse, marginalized populations is incredibly important. And on that note, as a professional consultant, we don't always have the leverage to dictate who participates in our engagement processes. So in some cases, we are kind of hamstrung, even if we design or co-design or put in the effort to design these participatory mapping processes or condition and risk assessment things that can include diverse views. Sometimes we are limited, to be honest, in what we're able to do. The positive side is, and the opportunity there is that increasingly there are protocols, ethical guidelines, standards that we can turn to and say, hey, yeah, this is a great initiative, well-funded, you have a good vision, but these are the things that we need to work on to make sure that these nature-based solutions do no harm at a minimum, and ideally address the outcomes that a diversity of populations care about, and not just from the perspective of a national government or a funder. So that's the project side. On the community side, I find that the best strategy to ensure, or at least increase the odds of these diverse perspectives to come into play, is to work through organizations with long-standing relationships with communities. ESSA, as a consulting firm, we work globally, we're small, but we don't have a long-standing relationship outside of North America with too many other communities of practice, or communities, geographic communities specifically. And so these long organizations with relationships understand and respect, well, in theory, and I found that to be the case in practice, understand and respect local values, norms, understand what the kind of power structures are, understand what kind of participatory methods might be most effective for those particular communities. And so working with organizations with these long-standing relationships to mainstream nature-based solutions into their ongoing programming, I think is a really wise strategy that I'm trying to pursue personally, or within the context of ESSA. Yeah, I look forward to talking a bit more about that in the future as well.
Okay, so we're just a couple of minutes from when we were supposed to go into the breakout groups, but I think I'm getting the signal that we can take another 5. Is that right, Utu? And so I just want to do kind of a lightning round to just ask each of the panelists to address a couple of specific questions. So briefly, please. Ben, when it comes to project developers weighing options for how to address climate change, the decision around whether or not to employ a nature-based solution really can come down to the value proposition. And in this discussion so far, we've heard a lot about the wide range of social values of nature-based solutions, but tell us when governments or communities are considering whether to pursue a conventional approach or a ecosystem-based approach to a climate challenge, what's the key value proposition for nature-based solutions, and what are the key opportunities as well as risks? Briefly, if you could, please, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And maybe Patricia, I'll just maybe address part of the question because we have a little time, but it is a really interesting question. I think it really builds on what Jimena said as well in her intervention, because I think she addressed some of the considerations that when we engage with governments, particularly through the Nature-Based Infrastructure Global Resource Center, how we engage with them. And the first, well, just to step back very briefly, I mean, definitely what we see governments are beginning to look at opportunities is they're looking at their infrastructure plans and their infrastructure requirements. And globally over the next 20 years, it's estimated that anywhere between sort of 80 and 95 trillion dollars will need to be invested in infrastructure, and that's gray infrastructure. And traditionally, most governments, obviously, when they're looking at infrastructure, they initially think of gray infrastructure, and that's also the project proponents. And so what we're doing with the nature-based infrastructure is meeting with governments and other project proponents and encouraging them to take a look at other opportunities, particularly nature-based infrastructure, which is, if you will, it's sort of a subset of nature-based solutions, but really focused on infrastructure needs. And what we found is that we've sort of scoped all the infrastructure plans globally and have identified that around 11% of what's being built right now in gray infrastructure could be shifted to nature-based infrastructure, and with tremendous cost savings. So our estimates show that around 50% of the cost of what a government might normally invest in a gray infrastructure project, the cost for nature-based infrastructure would be 50% less. And so tremendous cost savings that obviously governments then can invest in other ways with societal benefits. In terms of how we encourage project proponents to think through this, one of the points that was already made, but it's really critical to have robust stakeholder engagement processes. And one of the things we've tried to do is not only have those stakeholder engagement processes to understand the threats, risks, and benefits of the project, but then actually to incorporate that into the economic model itself, right? So into the decision-making documents that the project proponents rely on, the governments rely on, and the financial institutions rely on when they make that decision. And so we take those concerns, those risks, begin to place a value on those, and then run those all the way through the financial model as well. And I think this, understanding, considering the positive and negative externalities is absolutely critical in order to make the case for nature-based infrastructure. Because what we find is that not only does, when we do that, not only do we have cost savings, but we also have multiple benefits beyond what gray infrastructure is able to provide because it uses an ecosystem-based approach, and we have the multitude of ecosystem benefits as well, whether it's climate change adaptation or mitigation and ecosystem resilience. The other thing we really promote is considering the entire life cycle of the project, and that includes the planning, the implementation, maintenance, and end of life. So really, that's the way we engage with governments to get them to encourage them to really begin to think through other options beyond traditional gray infrastructure. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Ben. And earlier we had a number of great examples from Didier of international implementation of nature-based solutions, but I know, Jimena, you've worked a lot here in Canada, so I think it would be great if you could just give us perhaps a couple of examples of how nature-based solutions are being used to address challenges in Canada, particularly in regions where infrastructure has deficiencies and is being severely affected by climate change.
Yeah, thanks. And this aligns quite well with Ben's intervention just now. In the past few years, so just to back up, within ESSA, our international development work is about 10% by sales. So a lot of the work that we do is in North America. And in the past 4 years or so, just as an example, we've been supporting the work of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, MNAI. And MNAI is kind of a spin-off initiative from an initial project led by the David Suzuki Foundation and other partners. And basically they're working with small and medium-sized municipalities across Canada to map out their natural assets, quantify them, do an economic valuation of those natural assets to get them on their ledgers using accounting and asset management rules. So as Ben was mentioning, at the time of making decisions about infrastructure services, because that's how municipalities here are viewing them, right? It's like nature providing a service that a gray or hybrid solution could otherwise provide. At the time of making decisions, they're weighing up the cost and benefits of a traditional gray infrastructure solution like a water treatment plant versus a nature-based solution. So we've been supporting MNAI through mostly technical work, some evaluation work in doing the like scoping out, mapping out the natural asset, then modeling the ecosystem service flows coming from that natural asset and simulating different scenarios of different interventions relating to specific nature-based solutions. And as Ben was mentioning, we're still at a stage of the need to make a business case for nature-based solutions. It's slowly changing, but there's still that need. But in any case, we have found that our focus on ecosystem service valuation and the process that we bring, so maybe, you know, the work that we do with MNAI on the modeling side and software development, maybe not as translatable in other contexts, but the process itself is of just understanding what the outcomes that people want to see are, what are the natural assets attached to those outcomes, what are the ecosystem flows that come from those assets, and how to protect them going forward. And so that process itself is highly translatable, replicable, even in data constrained environments and with constraints of all kinds. And we're actually getting started on 2 projects in Latin America, in Jamaica and Panama, that are focused on mangrove restoration. And we're doing kind of the upfront planning work to inform the design of those interventions that are billed as nature-based solutions and funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, respectively, in those 2 countries. And yeah, so we're quite excited about kind of that transfer of what we've been doing in Canada in other contexts, working in partnership with organizations that are based in those countries at the site of the interventions.
That's really great to hear how those experiences being developed in Canada, which I know are very impressive, are being transferred to your work abroad. So just to round us off, Didier, if we think about the sort of broader approach to achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, would you say that this real kind of surge of interest in nature-based solutions is shifting the approach to how the SDGs can be achieved in the international context?
Yes, definitely yes. I think we have more and more not only proofs of concepts, but actual results that are proving, for example, that actually organic agriculture is able to feed humanity, that better management of water resources would allow every human being on this planet to have enough water to drink every day, and potable water, if the technology was applied appropriately. It is clearly proven that if we were able to manage properly and restore and expand key ecosystems such as mangroves, rainforests, but also urban ecosystems through microforests, living conditions would be much more bearable on this planet despite climate change. The crisis that we're also seeing nowadays around food is just showing how our system and our food systems in general are weak and not in line with any ambition with regards to sustainability in the long term. It's not normal that countries that have enormous amount of agricultural land are depending on wheat or sunflower oil that comes from Ukraine. So all those crises alongside the evidences that are coming research and experiments and practical work in the field are clearly showing that it is the way to go. It is, to me, actually pretty much the only way to go to reach the SDGs. And I think that more and more will believe in this, and more governments will understand that it is the way to go. There are so many very simple, creative solutions that could change the situation dramatically. I'll give you just one example. Kenya is producing every day 4,000 metric tons of wood ash. This wood ash, for the moment, we don't have any alternative to wood and charcoal in such a country. But if this wood ash was being used as a fertilizer and recycled properly in agriculture, this would be an enormous amount of chemical fertilizers that would be saved. And as you know, chemical fertilizers require an enormous amount of energy to be produced, and then to be transported, and then to be applied, which means that we have everywhere solutions and niches to explore and to evaluate.
Great, thank you, Didier. So you've seen, I think, the wealth of expertise from our panelists, and now you have an opportunity to engage with them in the breakout groups and drill down into how we really advance this effort towards nature-based solutions and scale it up and speed it up. So I'm going to ask Uju, who's no doubt, or is it going to be somebody else who's going to tell us what we need to do to move to the breakout part of the event.
Stepping in for Uju. For those of you who are online, you will be put into your breakout rooms shortly. And for those of us who are here in person, you might have remembered that when you signed up for this event, you had to choose a discussion group to join. So we ask that you join that discussion group. Patricia will be staying here in the library, and Jimena will be going outside into the atrium right by the windows in the back there. So this is the time to proceed to our breakout rooms, and we will have a total of 20 minutes together. Thank you.
All right. So we're reconvening. I hope we have Didier and Ben on line as well, because what we'd like to do in the few minutes remaining is just hear a little bit from each of the chairs of the groups about the highlights, I guess, of their discussions. So Jimena, why don't you kick off and tell us about your group?
I think this works. Okay. We had a bit of a broad ranging conversation, but the kind of theme that we were addressing was about participatory methods and assessment and monitoring implementation of nature-based solutions. And we started by talking about some of the kind of constraints or limitations to participatory processes within the context of projects that are donor funded or kind of designed by higher level external agencies. So we talked a bit about time being, flexibility and timelines being an important component. We talked a bit about how to institutionalize participatory processes within the local context, basically kind of integrating good practice in terms of participatory process for design of nature-based solutions, specifically with local structures and practices that communities already have. And I think when I came into this conversation, I heard something about terminology and like nomenclature that communities are familiar with, and even those kind of adopting or taking on board those conventions are incredibly important. And we talked a little bit about that. We also talked about, on the monitoring side, how to, on one hand, make sure that there's kind of real-time feedback on how the intervention is going and what are the benefits flowing, are there benefits? We don't have the luxury of time necessarily to wait 5 years to see whether a mangrove restoration project is delivering the ecosystem services and social economic benefits that are on paper. So getting some real-time feedback where possible. And in those kinds of systems, how to make sure that that information is not only held kind of by the project unit or at the higher level, but also feeding back into decisions at the community itself, and the community members being the holders of that knowledge and information as well. I think those are a couple of highlights from Margaret.
Thank you, Jimena. Ben, could you please give us the highlights from your online discussion?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so it was a very interesting discussion. We first, you know, I think in a very similar way, we first discussed trade-offs and specifically, you know, how those trade-offs can be, you know, can be addressed and particularly mitigated. And so the discussion really focused quite a bit on the importance of stakeholder engagement, and really trying to take stakeholder engagement to sort of to the next stage, which is, you know, is obviously to engage the stakeholders to understand, you know, the risks and their concerns, but also ensuring that those, you know, the stakeholder concerns are part of that decision-making process. And that can be done in a number of different ways, but certainly somehow reflecting them in the decision-making tools can be the most effective way. And so, yeah, so looking at those trade-offs and the importance of really, you know, really understanding how to mitigate any potential risks as well. We had a pretty long discussion on potential risks. You know, obviously in plenary we were mostly discussing the benefits of nature-based solutions, but there are some, you know, some risks that we need to be aware of, particularly given the fact that there is likely to be you know, increasing flow of investment to these kinds of projects. You know, we've seen, I mean, obviously with the GAC project, that's one potential area, but we can anticipate that this will be a trend that will continue to grow. And so, you know, and so what are those risks, and really trying to identify them and look at opportunities to mitigate them. And, you know, principal among those is really, you know, the risk that somehow the existing rights of the local population could be undermined by the nature-based solution. This is something we need to, you know, have a very, you know, keep kind of high, you know, on our radar, and try to identify early on in the process and mitigate. The last part of the discussion was really focused on supply and demand. You know, as I said, we're starting to see more supply of financing, although I think it's understood that this is still, you know, relatively limited in the grand scheme of things. But because we are seeing increased supply, you know, what work can be undertaken to help increase the amount of demand as well. And I think that's you know, and the kind of the educational opportunities to help increase that demand. We spoke a little bit about this idea of bankable projects that we often hear, and that there's, you know, some financial institutions indicate that there are a lack of bankable projects. Then really looked at the question of, you know, what does bankable mean currently, and is it really the appropriate metric on which we should be deciding on whether to invest or not? And are there ways to unpack that term bankable, and particularly unpack you know, the financial models that we use, which, you know, tend to be limited, you know, only to the financial flow, the cash flow, and tend to ignore some of the most important co-benefits of nature-based solutions, some of the benefits to local communities, and some of the benefits to ecosystems in nature. And you know, in that process of redefining bankable projects and you know, looking again at the tools, you know, could we in that way have a new sense of what bankable might mean, and really begin to trigger the level of financing required to address some of the societal challenges that we're hoping to in the coming decades.
Great, thanks, Ben. Didier, please, if you could tell us about your group.
Sure. Extremely interesting exchange and amazing questions by all the participants. Really, it's been around means and approaches to ensure adoption of nature-based solutions. This is a vast subject and a fairly complex one because it's contextual and it all entirely depends on the specific area where you're working, and then the type of communities and people you're working with. There were some a question around is it better to work and to start working with the communities collectively or individually? Clearly, experience shows that working collectively is a solution. Then how to address some bottlenecks and challenges, huge challenges around access to land, for example, for women. How do we address them? How do we try to bring solutions? And to bring solutions means co-develop solutions. I'll always insist on the fact that we need to co-develop systematically the solutions with the communities. It's not something that we parachute into the community and that we hope will work. And then very good remarks and questions about around scalability. How do we make sure, how we can make sure that a solution, a nature-based solution can be adopted by a large number of people and in a sustainable way. Extremely interesting dialogue around this. I will not elaborate more because it would take time and we don't have much, but it was really very interesting.
Great, great. Well, the group that I led in this room, also, I think we had a very rich discussion, which also went into these questions of some of the risks of implementing nature-based solutions. The example of Sri Lanka was noted, and I think we talked about how we need to ensure that we find effective ways to in essence, transition to nature-based solutions in a way that is community-driven, in a way that is, in some cases, gradual, in a way that does really learn from successful examples and enables communities to actually see those successful examples at work in other contexts, and really to avoid that risk, particularly in a developing donor context of a colonial approach, imposing upon communities an approach that may not be fully supported or even effective in that context, and how we need to be walking the talk at home in terms of implementing these solutions here at home before we ask developing countries to do so. So I think with that, we're just about, well, we're past time, and I apologize to those of you who had to be somewhere at 10:30. But I think for me, what's really come out of this report back session on the discussions, it is that participatory, stakeholder-driven approach to implementing nature-based solutions. I think we all know that, but I think we can't say it enough that we really need to be approaching this in a way that is very much community-driven, takes and really allows the leaders of these implementation of implementation of projects to be really driving their these choices and participating fully in the decisions around implementing nature-based solutions. I think the other theme that I heard in this report back was just around the financing aspect, which is also so critical, and that point that Ben mentioned about how financial models may need to be considered differently in the context of nature-based solutions, and finding ways to appropriately value all of the co-benefits that we've talked about so much today. So with that, I think there is a closing that Uju is here to give. So I will pass it to you, Uju, to send us out.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Thank you so much, Jimena. Thank you, Didier, Benjamin, for joining and just being very open and willing to share your ideas, share your knowledge in the general session and also in the breakout discussions as well. I'm sure everyone that participated can definitely say that it was helpful in some capacity or the other. Also, thank you to everyone. First of all, to those who made it in person, thank you so much. We're so glad to have you here. We do love having you in our space, in our building, and also people who joined online as well. We also want to say thank you for carving out time. I'm sure we all have very busy and demanding schedules, but making this a priority today. We're very appreciative of that. Just before we wrap up, we would love to get your feedback on how today's event was. So if you notice on the seats where you were seated, there was a little postcard that has a QR code. So if you can please scan the QR code to share your feedback, or if you also look at the screen, it's coming up on your screen. And also, there's also a link to subscribe to our events list as well, if you're not already part of that list, or if you don't already get emails about the various, learning and development, professional networking type of events that we host. So you can please also sign up to be a part of that list. Once again, I do welcome you to please share your feedback so that we can, better improve, better adapt to your needs. And this session, or this series, I should say, is the second out of 4 series that we're going to be having on climate change, resilience and adaptation. So definitely, if you want to stay connected with the remaining 2 sessions that we'll be having in the fall, so please, please, please make sure that you're either giving us your responses and or signing up to the mailing list. And lastly, right beside the refreshments, there was a little pamphlet with handouts that we've created just to curate a list of different important resources that our speakers have shared that we feel that will be beneficial to today's conversation. So the handouts is outside, and we'll also be sharing it via email as well. So please do check it out. I know during Benjamin's session, he mentioned a number of training resources that IISD offers, which is completely free. So yes, definitely. Thank you so much once again. Please do help yourself to the remaining refreshments, and we hope to see you once again. Thank you.